Capernaum is how you pronounce Capernaum in Hebrew. And we're going to follow Jesus there to see all kinds of miracles that he performed in that city. Shalom and welcome back. If you are joining us again for these teachings on the life of Jesus, if you're joining us for the first time, we welcome you as well. We're heading to the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee today to a place called Capernaum. It's actually pronounced Capernaum, the village of Nahum in Hebrew. Both in this session and the next one to follow, we're going to stay in Capernaum as we take a look at Mark 1, Mark 2, and eventually Luke 7 and John 6, and maybe even Mark chapter 8 or 9, as we talk about all the healings that Jesus did here. Now, this city was essentially his ministry base here in the Galilee, the city of Capernaum, and that's for good reason, and we'll explore that in our teaching here as we begin shortly. Again, if you are wanting to follow us in our teaching as we teach the Bible in the context of the land of Israel, please subscribe and hit the bell as well. That way you can stay informed of all of our new production and teachings that will be forthcoming. Let's get right now to our story and our teaching that took place at Capernaum. So here we go. We're going to fly over the land of Israel, this small parcel of land within the larger context of the ancient Near Eastern world. Israel was the center of this area, this region, the land that is about 300 miles in length and maybe 75 at its widest point. We're going to explore the ministry of Jesus in this place called Capernaum, and specifically using the stories of Mark 1 and 2, the three healing stories of the demoniac, Peter's mother, and the paralytic. So we go to the Sea of Galilee. It's in northern Israel, and specifically to this northwest corner, taking a closer look at this lake that's 13 miles long and maybe 7 miles at its widest point, as we have been teaching here. Capernaum is our main focus as we talk about this city that Jesus used as, I'll call it a sort of a ministry home base, if you will, his home away from home, because he grew up in Nazareth. And yet here in the Galilee area, he returned oftentimes to this city. Once again, in Hebrew, it's called Capernaum, the village of Nahum. So from Nazareth, Jesus would have walked through the valley of the doves, through the cliffs of the Arbel, and he would have, perhaps on occasion, enjoyed the view from on top of the cliff of Arbel. Capernaum is located here on this northwestern corner. So all of these shorelines on the west side, the northwest side, the north, and of course the east side would have been populated by communities. Here on the east side, more Gentiles, and certainly on the west side, more Jewish communities. So there is the area of Capernaum, and what it looked like. Of course, this is just an illustration, but it was one of 15 ancient harbors here. Peter, Andrew, James, and John were fishermen. Of course, Peter lived here. His mother-in-law, as we're going to see, also lived with him. The main building is depicted as the synagogue, and yet we know that through archaeological excavations that started early on, with the Catholic fathers actually excavating here first, decades ago. The city was maybe 1,500 in population. Some say only 1,000, but it was located on a main route, and certainly this city was right on the border between the regions of some of the Herod sons of King Herod the Great. So here in the northwest corner, maybe the city looked like this. So the first story takes us to the synagogue, where we have a man who is possessed by an evil spirit. Let's read the story first, and then we'll come back to what the synagogue looks like in just a short moment. They went to Capernaum, and when the Sabbath came, Jesus went into the synagogue and began to teach. The people were amazed at his teaching because he taught them as one who had authority, not as teachers of the law. We teach here at Biblical Israel Ministries and Tours the importance of that word. Hebrew word is smekah. It means authority. It is not simply deemed casually upon a rabbi, but even here in Capernaum, the religious and Jewish sources tell us that there were at least 3 or 4 others who were also deemed with authority, or smekah. Jesus was one of them. So just then a man in their synagogue who was possessed by an evil spirit cried out, "What do you want with us, Jesus of Nazareth? Have you come to destroy us? I know who you are, the Holy One of God." "Be quiet," said Jesus sternly, "come out of him." The evil spirit shook the man violently and came out of him with a shriek. And the people were all so amazed that they asked each other, "What is this? A new teaching, and with," here's that key word, "authority?" He even gives orders to evil spirits, and they obey him. News about him spread quickly over the whole region of Galilee. So this man is befriended by Jesus. He recognizes who Jesus is. And while we have a 5th century synagogue as the result of excavations here, it's most likely built on at least a portion of the 1st century synagogue. I just actually looked at the archaeological models or the diagrams early on when it was first excavated, and there's not a really good consensus that underneath the entire 5th century synagogue was the 1st century one. But there are certainly 1st century ruins, and if it was indeed a synagogue underneath, it was a modest one at best. But most likely that's where this took place, below this level. In fact, you can see below the white limestone the foundation for the 1st century structures, and perhaps here in this corner where the archaeologist exposed a little further down is a portion of that synagogue. All these other houses and dwellings are from the 1st century. So here's a close-up of this 5th century synagogue. It's quite impressive, and yet it dates, of course, centuries after the time of Jesus. Back in the day when it was first excavated, even before it was excavated, you can see what the synagogue looked like. So through the science of archaeology, the Catholic Church Fathers did a wonderful job in not only excavating the area, but restoring the synagogue. If you ever wondered what a synagogue in the 1st century looked like, perhaps this is a good replica. Some had benches around the circumference of this rectangular structure, such as the one that we see still today at Magdala and Gamla, 2 1st century synagogues. These were gathering places where these rabbis deemed with authority taught. So Jesus taught in the synagogue, and he also exorcised the evil spirit from this man. He is overwhelmed with joy. he is transformed completely. And all the people said, "What is this? New teaching and with authority?" They are wondering who Jesus of Nazareth is early on in his ministry. Right after the healing here in the synagogue, Jesus goes and heals Peter's mother-in-law. This is a good Christian artistic illustration, if you will, of the healing, of course, done in a very orthodox way. But the story unfolds this way. As soon as they left the synagogue, they went with James and John to the home of Simon and Andrew. Simon's mother-in-law was in bed with a fever, and they told Jesus about her. So he went to her, took her hand, and helped her up. The fever left her, and she began to wait on them. That evening after sunset, why after sunset? Because now the Shabbat, or the Sabbath, was over. 3 stars have been located in the skies, and now the normal routine could be continued. So that evening after the Shabbat was over, the people brought to Jesus all the sick and demon-possessed. And the whole town gathered at the door, and Jesus healed many who had various diseases. He also drove out many demons, but he would not let the demons speak because they knew who he was. Now the early church archaeologists here, the Catholic fathers, excavated what they believed was a first-century dwelling in the middle of these structures. You can see, first of all, the octagonal structure of a church that was later built, most likely in the 5th or 6th century A.D. There's also another structure inside the octagonal one, and that's probably a century before this church. But right in the middle is a first-century dwelling, and most likely is not the very home of Peter, but it's traditionally announced to be that. We're not sure, but it's interesting that if indeed that was the home of Peter, the miracle of Jesus healing his mother-in-law took place right here. You can see the reconstructed walls of these 2 ancient churches built around the ruins. And then our final healing story or narrative from Capernaum. We touched on this individually before. This is a reconstructed house at a city called Katsrin. Katsrin is a Talmudic village in the Golan Heights. That means it dates between the 3rd and the 7th century A.D. Even though it does date a couple centuries after the time of Jesus, can you picture a house looking like this, complete with walls, storage areas, lamps, oil lamps, and of course we'll notice the roof, made with beams in one direction and sticks in another, and the roof was rolled with mud, the mud pack that was rolled with a stone, actually. So can we picture this story now happening in a house like this? A few days later, when Jesus again entered Capernaum, the people heard that he had come home. So many gathered that there was no room left, not even outside the door, and he preached the word to them. Some men came, bringing to him a paralytic carried by 4 of them. Since they could not get him to Jesus because of the crowd, they made an opening in the roof above Jesus, and after digging through it, lowered the mat the paralyzed man was lying on. When Jesus saw their faith, he said to the paralytic, "Son, your sins are forgiven." Now some teachers of the law were sitting there, thinking to themselves, "Why does this fellow talk like this? He's blaspheming. Who can forgive sins but God alone?" Immediately Jesus knew in his spirit that this was what they were thinking in their hearts, and he said to them, "Why are you thinking these things? Which is easier, to say to the paralytic, your sins are forgiven, or to say, get up, take your mat, and walk? But that you may know that the Son of Man has authority on earth to forgive sins. He said to the paralytic, I tell you, get up, take your mat, and go home. He got up, took his mat, and walked out in full view of them all. This amazed everyone, and they praised God, saying, We have never seen anything like this. The man is healed physically. Jesus displays authority once again, but his sins are forgiven. What's remarkable about this man is that he was an outcast. A paralyzed man, like a leper or a blind person, would have no chance of being accepted in their community. And, of course, someone must have sinned early on, whether before he was born or his parents, so that he had no chance to be forgiven. And yet Jesus saw his spiritual need and said, Son, your sins are forgiven. It's yet another wonderful story about the life and ministry of Jesus. You know, to see the very city called Capernaum, to understand, to be able to imagine what it looked like, the size of it, the makeup of the city, and then to try to place Jesus there and to listen to these three stories of what he did. First in the synagogue, and then in the house of Peter, and then finally the paralyzed man who was dropped down from the roof of this modest first century house, and Jesus not only heals him physically, but as we saw, he touches his heart and forgives his sins also. It's what Jesus still does. He heals both physically when we call upon his name, and more importantly, he heals us spiritually when we confess our sin, when we realize that we cannot save ourselves, when we come to a point in our spiritual journey where there's much, much more than just trying to be a good person. We accept Jesus for who he is, and certainly as the one who took our place on the cross eventually as he gave his life for us. That way, when we ask for forgiveness, we can entrust our lives, our spiritual lives, to his capable care. He does have the authority to forgive you and me, no matter what we have done in our lives. We entrust our lives to his care, and we claim his salvation. So thanks for joining us for these teachings from Capernaum. That's a new word that I hope that you can now use as you read all the occasions when Jesus is here in this town located on the northwest corner of the Sea of Galilee. Until next time, shalom, shalom.